So now we take a look at the second approach or second method when using the income approach. And that's the gross rent multiplier, or GRM, GRIM, we call it sometimes. And I will tell you, this one is much easier. In fact, this is like really simple. So hopefully you'll be glad to hear that. And if you remember, this is the method, the gross rent multiplier you'd want to use if it's for like a residential rental property. Okay. You remember the capitalization approach was best for commercial, gross rent multiplier is best for residential. And statistically speaking, most real estate agents just focus on residential properties. Again, you may decide to get into commercial, and that's fine. And if you do, then you're probably going to want to get very acquainted with that capitalization approach we talked about in the last session. But here, the gross rent multiplier, I think you should be using a lot. And unfortunately, I don't think most real estate agents are using this method. Rather, what they'll do, let me give you an example here why this is so important. You'll have, a property investor call you up. Maybe he's got a rental property and he decides to sell the property. And a lot of times what the agent will do to try to figure out the value, they'll just use the sales comparison approach and do a market analysis. That is not what you want to do if it's an income producing property. Why does this matter? Well, here's why. First of all, if it's a rental property, and assuming it's currently rented to a tenant, and I will tell you that's a very favorable situation for an investor to already have a tenant in place. But the investor does not really care about the market value per se, at least in terms of sales comparison. Because what the investor cares about is the return on their value, right? And I'm trying not to get too deep, and I apologize for that. I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but when it comes to this return on their investment, rather, I think I said in value, but their return about that ROI, that return on their investment, and that's all they care about. They care about the numbers. If the numbers add up, and you'll see how this works here in just a second, then they'll buy the property. But if the numbers are not adding up or equal what the investor's return should be, then they're not going to buy the property. And they don't care what it is worth based on sales comparison. So it's all based on the income. That's what this is based on. So, and I will tell you, the value you come up with using the income approach often, if not almost entirely, is going to be different than what you're going to come up with sales comparison. So, it's important to use the right approach to value, depending on the type of property and what it's being used for, right? Because, listen, if you were selling your house, if you just did the sales comparison approach, and it's an income producing property, there's a tenant currently in the property paying rent. Who do you think, when you put that property on the market, who do you think the likely buyer is going to be? It's going to be an investor. I'm not saying they can't do it, but there's not very many people looking to buy a house to move into that's currently rented out, and there might be 6, 8, 10 months still left on their lease. Right? So your typical buyer is not going to be the person likely to buy. It's going to likely be an investor, and they only care about the money part, the income. So that's why the income approach is critical. So if you don't learn how to do what we're about to go over now, you probably should not be listing rental properties. Okay? You need, and this is very easy, very easy. as you're getting ready to see. So what you're looking at right now on the slide are the formulas again. In this case, for gross rent multiplier, there's only two formulas, right? And again, there's only three components again, three parts here. If you know the sales price of a property and you know what the monthly rent is, so when we talk about rent, here we're talking about monthly. This is not annual. Monthly rent. So sales price divided by the rent, that's where you'll get your gross rent multiplier. And then once you know the gross rent multiplier, as you see in that second formula, then you could take the gross rent multiplier times the rent, again the monthly rent, and that would give you the value of the property. So those are the two formulas you need to remember. One you multiply, one you divide. Okay. But here's an example of how this might work using the gross rent multiplier, and just how easy this is. In fact, I think this is easier than the sales comparison approach, to be honest with you. But let's say I've got my subject property that obviously now I'm trying to figure out the value for. And again, assuming it's an income property, which it is. What would you suppose the first thing I would want to know about the property? What's the income, right? What's the income? How much you rent it for? Well, let's say in this example, this subject property rents for $1,150 per month. Well, now I'm trying to figure out the value of that property. And we know to figure out the value, in addition to the rent, which I already know, now I need to know what is the gross rent multiplier for this market. Now, and I'm going to tell you, it will vary a lot of times in terms of that gross rent multiplier by areas, okay? Certainly within different markets. So, don't think you can just use a gross rent multiplier for every one. They're all going to be different every single time. So anyway, how do I figure out the gross rent multiplier? Well, again, very similar to sales comparison. I have to find a similar or comparable property, that obviously an income producing property or rental property that has recently sold. And let's say I find a comparable property. And again, once they're closed, this information is public knowledge now. We now know this information. We know that comparable property, this one rented for $1,225 a month, and we know it's sold for $200,000. That's obviously whatever it's sold for. That's the value. And I now have enough information with that comparable property to figure out my gross rent multiplier, right? To do that, I just take the value, $200,000, divided by the rent, which was $1,225, and that should give you a gross rent multiplier of 163. Now, and some change. You got to be 163 points, yada, yada, yada. But what we're going to do here is we're going to just round it to the nearest number, which I think is 163. And I will tell you, if you were getting a question like this on the test, they would more than likely but pay attention to what it tells you to do in the question. But it may tell you to round it to the nearest whole number. They may tell you to round it to 1 decimal place or 2 decimal places. Obviously you do whatever they instruct you to do in the question. But in this case, we're just going to round it to the nearest whole number. So our gross rent multiplier would be 163. So I can transfer that information to my subject property. So I now know for my subject property, the rent again is $1,150. The gross rent multiplier for this market is 163. Well, to figure out the value, I multiply the gross rent multiplier, 163, times the rent, 1150, and that would give me a value of $187,450. Yeah, and that's all there is to it. That is very, very simple. Now let me that's all you're going to need to know for test purposes. Okay, you just need to know how this gross rent multiplier works. But I did want to share. I want to share this with you because I'm going to tell you, if you'll get used to doing this, if you can find an investor that will want to work with you continuously, you can make a lot of money. Because here's what you need to understand about what's actually going on here. And I don't think even agents that use this, I don't think they even realize what's really going on. But if you look at this gross rent multiplier right here, in this case it says the gross rent multiplier is 163. Well, what does that mean? What that means is this. If I pay $1,225 a month, which is what the rent is, and I pay that $1,225 for 163 months, that's going to pay off $200,000, right? So basically the gross rent multiplier is telling you how many months you would have to pay whatever the rent is to equal the value, okay? So what an investor might do, they might tell you, I'm looking for a property, an investment property that will pay for itself in, say, 12 years, right? Well, and I will tell you that's very common. Something like, they may say 11 years or 10 years, whatever. Well, if you know that, then you can now figure out what gross rent multiplier this investor is looking for, right? So how many months are in 12 years? So 12 times 12 is 144 months. So your gross rent multiplier would be 144, right? Well, so now you know your investor's looking for a property to invest in, but they want their gross rent multiplier to be 144. If they said 11 years, and obviously, what is that? 132 would be the gross rent multiplier. But why does that matter? Because if I see on the MLS or wherever you're looking for properties for sale, and I'm talking about rental properties, if I know the gross rent multiplier in this example is 144, and I multiply that by whatever, because obviously they got to say this is a rental property and it's currently rented for $1,000 a month, right? Just take whatever they say the rent is on that property times this gross rent multiplier 144, and let's see, what would that be? What did I say, $1,000 a month? So 144 times $1,000 in rent. So that would give you a value of $144,000. So your your investor is willing to pay up to $144,000. And then excuse me. And then you just look at what's the property listed for. Let's just say it was listed at $150,000. Well, obviously the investor's only interested in going up to as high as 144. But still, is that close enough that maybe we can make an offer and maybe negotiate it down to the 144? And I will tell you, it is, most of the time anyway. But if the seller doesn't accept it, then you don't get the property. So, then you move on to the next one. But that's all you're doing. So typically, if you just find the property, investors are going to buy it as long as the numbers work. And a lot of times, in fact, most of the time, a lot of investors, they don't ever go look at the property. They don't even care what that property looks like. They don't care. They only care about the numbers. If the numbers work, they'll buy it. So, hopefully that makes sense to you there. Again, the gross rent multiplier is a very simple approach to value, commonly used on residential rental properties. But now we've talked about gross rent multiplier and capitalization, and between the two, that's how you figure out the value based on the income approach.